mostly a criminal law theorist, so just a little caveat to start with. But I really enjoyed Adil's essay. I thought it was lucid, challenging, as is typical of Adil's work. So just to recap a little bit and to focus on Adil's position, in the paper that Adil sent me in the presentation, Adil purports to defend a claim, that's the main claim, that it's intrinsically morally wrong to use weapons that either by their nature or by their use are more likely to strike civilians or civilian objects who are not directly participating in hostilities than to strike combatants or military objectives, with the understanding that the civilians in question, unlike the combatants, are not directly morally liable to such strikes. Now, the implications of this claim are pretty significant. And to see why, well, let's consider Adil's own case of the non-state armed group that is constrained to use very inaccurate primitive weapons, rockets, against an advanced military because it doesn't have more precise weapons. Now, Adil's claim is that it's wrong, it's impermissible, it's unjustifiable, it's even inexcusable for the non-state armed group to use such weapons, even if all the following general conditions that are arguably found elsewhere in the laws of war are satisfied. That is, this kind of use is wrong, even if the group does not intend to target non-directly liable civilians or civilian objects, even if the use of such weapons is necessary to the group's cause, which let's assume is just, say it's defensive, even if their use is E-proportionate or expectable proportionate, and that the expected value of the military advantage that would be secured, discounted by the probability of striking the target, is greater than the non-liable civilian harm that would be inflicted, discounted by the probability of striking civilians. And even if their use is DE proportionate, deontic expectable proportionate, and that the number of civilian lives saved or harmed, or saved from harm, as it were, is sufficiently greater than the number of civilians killed or harmed to account for the moral fact that killing or harming is substantially worse than letting die or letting harm. So Adil claims that even when an attack with an imprecise weapon meets all the conditions, it is still wrong if the use of the weapon will probably not, or most likely than not, strike non-liable civilians. It is still wrong because one needs at least an undefeated reason to believe that a weapon will strike a legitimate target to have a valid justification or excuse for using this weapon against it. Here, I think one may quibble with the deal that some sound excuses for using indiscriminate weapons may be rooted in effective experience as opposed to cognition. Think of duress, provocation, and the like. Or perhaps in one's capacity to do otherwise, such that the lack of an undefeated reason to believe may not entail inexcusability. But I take it this is not what Adil has in mind when he writes that, I quote him here from the paper he sent me, it is morally unjustifiable and inexcusable to use a weapon that will probably, or more likely than not, strike civilians. What he's claiming, I take it, is one, that it is impermissible to use a weapon unless one has a belief that it will strike a legitimate target, and such belief is reasonable, and two, that such belief cannot be reasonable unless, as a matter of objective factual probability, use of the weapon in question will probably, or most likely, strike a legitimate target. So his assertion of inexcusability may not be as absolute as he makes it to be in the piece. So Adil tells us if striking one's target could, and that's the example that's on the handout, would save 100 civilian lives from being killed, but there's only 30% chance of hitting the target and a 70% chance of missing the target and killing 10 additional civilians, then the attack is impermissible. It is impermissible even though it does not intentionally target civilians, even though it's necessary, it's E-proportionate, it's DE proportionate. According to Adil, the only case where such a low probability of hitting a legitimate target and saving civilians could ground permissible use of a weapon, in the face of a much higher probability of missing and killing additional non-liable civilians, is when such use would expectably save a far greater number of civilians as it could possibly kill. And in the paper that Adil sent me, the ratio he uses about is 100 times greater. That's the example he gives of order of magnitude. That is much greater than what he thinks is required for DE proportionality. But he declines to settle the question in the paper. So numbers count for a deal, but they will only count in extremis. Now, I think this position is quite demanding, perhaps excessively demanding, in at least two ways. First, Adil's claim sometimes seems to be that his reasonable belief standard can only be satisfied when a weapon satisfies a minimum standard of accuracy, presumably anything over 50%, although Adil only implies this in the paper when he uses expressions like probably and most likely. So in other words, Adil seems to argue that the reasonableness of the belief in question must be established on the basis of objective probability. That is, an empirical fact about the world. A problem here is that epistemic access to this fact may be obstructed in all sorts of ways, such that given the evidence available, it may be impossible to come to know it accurately, or it may be unreasonable to expect the weapon handler, or anyone else, for that matter, to come to know it accurately. So while epistemic assessments of probability may be mistaken as compared to objective true probabilities, such mistakes may still be reasonable given the evidence available. Now, Adil has the conceptual tools in the paper to deal with this. He speaks of fact-relative and evidence-relative domains of assessment. Where he seems to err sometimes, at least in the written version, is in equating fact-relative permissibility, which he also refers to as justification, with the ex post facto conclusion that one actually hit one's legitimate target, and evidence-relative permissibility, which he also characterizes as excuse, with equating that with the ex-ante objective empirical probability of it happening. Instead, it seems to me, evidence-relative permissibility ought to be based on or understood relative to available evidence, while fact-relative permissibility may be associated with objective empirical probability. And this would create the space for some permissible, evidence-relative permissible, uses of imprecise weapons, even when the objective empirical probability that they will hit their legitimate target is below 50%. Now, I concede here that might be unduly harsh, and that Adil may not be committed to defending his position as I framed it. However, sentences like, and that's in the paper, he says this moral requirement, that is the reasonable belief requirement, sets a minimum standard of accuracy that every weapon must satisfy. It makes it seem as though he's conflating what may be called objective and epistemic probabilities. Now, another way in which I think Adil's argument is quite demanding, perhaps excessively so, is that it entails, once again, building on his own example, that a non-state armed group with only imprecise weapons at its disposal is morally prohibited from using them, even though it would not target non-liable civilians or civilian objects, and even though the use of such weapons is necessary, again, let's assume for their just cause, and that it's expectable and deontic expectable proportionate. That is, unless the group's use of imprecise weapons would expectably save a far greater number of civilians as it could possibly kill, and thus meet the exceptional number threshold that is countenanced by Adil, say 1,000 lives saved versus 10 killed, well, it may need to, that is, the group might need to sit there passively. It may need to sit there passively even if it is facing periodic deadly attacks at the hands of a more advanced state military, until, that is, Adil's exceptional threshold of death or harm is reached, or until the group manages to obtain, perhaps at the grace of the international community, some more precise weapons. Somehow, when I think of cases like Syria or Burma, pre-pseudo-peace, where the state is much better armed than opposing non-state armed groups, and where it's not clear that Adil's exceptional threshold is often met, well, I find this conclusion hard to endorse. At the very least, it's not as intuitively appealing as it seems to be for Adil. That is, I find it hard to accept that in such cases, the difference between a weapon being, say, 45% accurate and, say, a weapon that is 55% accurate is, all else being equal, morally determinative. And by all else being equal, I mean that in both cases, intentionality, necessity, E and DE proportionality requirements are met, and probability is the only salient factor. Now, Adil argues that meeting such conditions is not sufficient for permissibility in the case of imprecise weapons, since, he says, permissibility entails that the use of a weapon that harms a non-liable civilian must be defendable to her. A weapon user must be able to defend his use to her. And Adil tells us that is based on his reasonable beliefs about the impact of his action on her rights and welfare and the rights and welfare of others. In Adil's words, the weapon user's defense cannot be, and again I quote him, I reasonably believe that I would miss my intended target, harm civilians, which happen to include you, and prevent no harm to others. However, I also reasonably believe that if I and others like me launch similar attacks, situations then over time will prevent substantially more harm than we inflict. Adil argues that such a response would be objectionable in deontic terms, on which he doesn't settle, because it's based on aggregative expected value. Now, I'm not quite sure the source of my discomfort with this part of Adil's argument, but let me make a number of very, very tentative suggestions at this point. So perhaps the attacker's defense would not be that he reasonably believed that he would miss his legitimate target, but that he reasonably believed that he had a 45% chance, or even a straight-up 50% chance of hitting his target, and that this very high possibility, which is short of Adil's most likely threshold, was morally significant in light of the number of civilians that stood to be saved, even if, again, it's still short of Adil's exceptional threshold. You could then argue that this belief showed no disrespect to the civilian victims of his mess, or at least not significantly more than a probability of, say, 50.1% would have shown. So in other words, couldn't the spectrum of permissibility be more gradual than Adil allows? It seems to me we'd need to know a bit more about what it takes to respect civilians, a question that Adil doesn't want to get into in the paper. Now, if indeed the threshold of over 50% is, as Adil would have it, a firm moral threshold, then couldn't it also be argued that aggregation is part of the very nature of probabilities, and that mere resort to probabilities is morally unacceptable on Adil's own terms? So, for example, Stephen Perry defends an objective conception according to which a probability is just the stable relative frequency that may be exhibited by the occurrences of a given attribute within a series of events or objects in the physical world, where those events or objects can, in an appropriate way, be characterized as similar. So insofar as any assessment of a probability calls for the assessment of a series of similar events, factual or counterfactual, of which a given occurrence is just one out of an aggregate of many, are we not violating the rights of civilians, or otherwise unacceptably disrespecting them, whenever we gamble their fate on the basis of such aggregative data? Of course, I'm conscious that probabilities may be all we have, at least ex ante facto, and that the morality of war could hardly do without them. So perhaps the aggregative nature of probabilities only points to the need for a higher threshold of reasonable belief than mere probability, or over 50%, if non-liable civilian victims are to be treated as dignified, inviolable, separate persons on which we should not impose principles that they could not reject. These are all the tests that Adil floats in the paper. But we can't really explore this proposal without engaging, I say, in deeper debates about moral philosophy, which Adil tries to steer us away from. Then again, perhaps I'm wrong on both counts, and my discomfort with Adil's position in respect of the non-state armed group has to do with more general assumptions, which he makes earlier on in the paper. So for one thing, Adil is careful to specify that his scenario assumes a non-international armed conflict. He also mentions, which is not in the paper, the case of international intervention, but let's focus on the non-international armed conflict case between a state and a non-state armed group in which all civilians are members of the same political community. Now, this move excludes ab initio the possibility that the non-state armed group may have obligations to members of its political community, associative duties, he calls them, that may affect its moral position and that may contribute to making some, say, defensive attacks with lower probabilities of success permissible. It might be considerations of this sort that skew my intuitions, since many hugely asymmetrical conflicts may be characterizable as conflicts where different political communities are clashing. And here I have in mind conflicts like between the Kachin, the Shan, or the Karen minority groups and the Myanmar army, or between the Sunni insurgents and the Shia-dominated Syrian state, or between distinct tribes and state-led armies in many African countries, or even between Palestine and Israel. Or could it be that Adil's suggestion that all civilians not directly participating in hostilities are not liable to be killed or harmed in armed conflicts is unduly restrictive? As Victor Tajos has recently suggested, may there not be situations where it would be fundamentally unfair only to hold combatants liable in armed conflicts. In other words, may there not be situations where non-combatants could also legitimately be held vicariously responsible for combatants' deeds, say because of how hard it is for combatants to avoid rendering themselves liable to be harmed, of how much non-combatants benefit from them fighting, and of non-combatants' duty to support a standing army. Now, I cannot argue for such a suggestion here. There's a lot more work to be done on this case, and I can only offer it as a provocation to think about situations in which discrimination and probabilities of success may matter less than Adil thinks they do. I could also mention the even more controversial possibility of collective liability, but in a crowd such as this, I think I just forget that I mentioned it. Now, the fact that Adil sets up his core scenario in terms of an internecine conflict taking place within one and the same state and political community may make these kinds of claims harder to defend. Indeed, the setup tends to blur relationships and normative links between non-combatants and combatants on both sides. Yet even in such scenarios, it seems to me that vicarious liability, and possibly collective liability, might impact how accurate an attack must predictably be to be permissible, and that there's some work to be done there. Now, Adil's reply might simply be here that he does not need to address such messy possibilities. Why? Well, because methodologically, he's operating within the confines of the existing laws of war, which single out civilians as non-liable parties. To be sure, some of the provisions he sets out to interpret are explicitly aimed at, and I quote, forestalling incidental loss of civilian life, injuries to civilians, damage to civilian objects, or a combination thereof. So the task he gives himself is simply to, and I quote, resolve any residual indeterminacy through moral reasoning in light of the moral aims of that legal norm. Now, this leaves open the question whether Adil really thinks, as he later affirms, that it is intrinsically morally wrong to use weapons that, either by their nature or their use, are more likely to strike civilians or civilian objects than to strike combatants or military objectives. Now, I do not wish to drag him into the kind of jurisprudential controversies that he seeks to avoid, but I would be curious to know more about his views about the relationship between law and morality. Is he merely trying to come up with the best moral interpretation of the law in a kind of Dworkin, peace be upon him, like way, or does he actually think the basic legal premise of civilian immunity is correct, and that his argument about imprecise weapon is morally true, all things considered? My sense is that that's the latter position that he wants to endorse because of what he tells us at the beginning of his presentation and paper. Now, if that's the case, then then it may be that one day he'll have to tell us what he makes of arguments for vicarious and collective liability, insofar as there are any out there that are plausible. Although this may understandably wait for another day, perhaps in his book, which is upcoming with Oxford University Press, to which I all greatly invite you to pay attention when it comes out. I mean, we're the only readers of our book, so we might as well just... Thank you.